All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, one of the most iconic protest signs of the Trump era was this one. One liberal's simple desire to be able to forget all this caring about politics stuff and just go back to brunch, back to sleep. In a lot of ways, Joe Biden is the human embodiment of this sign with an affect like Xanax and a platform like last week's leftovers. His aggressively conventional rhetoric and campaign goes down like chicken soup for the type of liberal who felt like everything was going just fine before Donald Trump came along. It makes sense in a way that Joe Biden would be doing so well right now, with chaos raining down on us from seemingly every direction. The familiar guy with the standard issue American political rhetoric and his revenge of the normies campaign feels to many like just what the doctor ordered. It's no accident that relatively affluent people in the suburbs are the beating heart of the Biden campaign. He is the ideal candidate for, let's say, Fairfax County, Virginia. The normal that existed for them during the Obama years was actually working out pretty decently. Sure, the life of the white-collar professional can feel a little soulless, a little deadening, but the upside is that the entire economy, political system, and culture is set up to cater to you and whisper to you that you are in fact special and that you and your kids do in fact deserve to be part of the class of American winners. The New York Times is out with a whole big new effort outlining what they portray as Trump's unprecedented threat to America. In the introduction editorial, they write that, quote, Donald Trump's re-election campaign poses the greatest threat to American democracy since World War II. They add later that Mr. Trump stands without any real rivals as the worst American president in modern history. George W. Bush's war crimes, Reagan's coups, and Nixon's corruption and racism would like to have a word on that front. But I digress. The whole idea is that if we can just rid ourselves of Trump, we can go back to the old America, the good America. It's liberals' version of Make America Great Again. Rather than revert back to the 50s GOP fantasy, they would like to snap back to the Obama-era Democratic fantasy. This delusion ignores a lot, of course. First of all, that the good old days weren't so good, which is exactly why they ended in the election of Donald J. Trump. But second of all, there are trends in American life which can't just be put back into the bottle and which have only accelerated over the years. There is no back to brunch, back to sleep, back to normal. You can't just write this all off as sort of a weird historical acid trip. Let's start with the most obvious and tangible, glaring omission from the liberal fantasy of the forthcoming Biden era in which Trump is banished, which is that Trump is not actually going to be banished. That guy is not going away quietly to paint on his ranch. He will be obnoxiously all over Twitter and television, and even after what has felt like a lifetime of him occupying the White House, a rating-starved media industry has never for 1 second been able to look away. The base still loves him. He's still got a hold on them like no other figure in Republican politics. Do you think a tiny thing like a presidential election loss is going to shake that? Of course not. The embarrassing ghouls in this town will still prostrate themselves at his feet and cower at his displeasure. He may not have the White House, but he will still be the leader of the opposition, and it's actually, frankly, a position in which he's much more comfortable. Next up, let's consider the trends that brought us to the Trump era, shall we? Decades of anti-government rhetoric combined with endemic corruption have destroyed the trust of our institutions. In the last decade, we had too big to fail and too big to jail. Now we're witnessing in real time as the politically connected get their COVID bailout goodies, and they were provided with inside information as to the real scope and scale of the pandemic fallout. Every single institution we were meant to rely on during COVID failed, leaving Americans frightened and frustrated, and not even sure that they would take a vaccine that our public health officials certify as safe and effective. Trump has blown up every last shred of trust in government. Meanwhile, the media has utterly beclouded itself in the Trump era, indulging in endless conspiracy theorizing and embarrassing self-importance. Inequality is, of course, another reason why we got Trump, and boy, I've got some bad news for you there. Trump's tax cuts funneled even more money to the top, even before COVID, and now we are witnessing an unprecedented transfer of wealth to the very tippy top. A K-shaped recovery has meant the bottom 50% is completely decimated as the top finds themselves better off than ever and poised like vultures to sweep in and gobble up the carrion of the shuttered and struggling businesses now littering our landscape. This inequality translates into a massive geographic divide, with entire swaths of America effectively abandoned to the, quote, gales of creative destruction. This inequality has also in part fueled a massive cultural divide between urban and rural, between college-educated and not, between white-collar and everyone else, which has, of course, also been on full display in pandemic-era America. The masks, the lockdowns, the protests, those have all been battlefields in that ongoing war. The media spends all day, every day convincing us our fellow citizens are in fact an existential threat. If you think that Trump as president is necessary to maintain that dynamic, then you are sadly mistaken. If anything, his own awfulness was a distraction from trying to convince us that our neighbor is really the biggest threat to our health and well-being. Generational divides will continue to fracture our politics, as generations that were forged by war, financial collapse, and instability wholesale reject the politics of old, a politics which is about to try to reassert itself here in Washington, D.C. Do not mistake the animating desire to vote against Donald Trump as a vote for or endorsement of Joe Biden. It is neither. The Democratic Party is doing their level best to push these young Americans into the corner, to muzzle them, to render them permanently irrelevant. But obviously that is not a sustainable situation. To sum it up, the neoliberal order has fallen apart. And yet here we are, electing an unreconstructed neoliberal without having fixed a single one of the fissures that brought us here in the first place. How's that going to work out? It's hard to say exactly, but there will certainly be nothing normal about it, and I wouldn't count on a brunchy oblivion anytime soon. We could easily look back and long for the carefree days of 2020. And Sagar, this is one of the foremost reasons why Joe Biden became the nominee.
Yes.
And why he's, frankly, today cruising likely to being the next president of the United States, because of this deeply ingrained, back to brunch fantasy. And it is exactly that. It is a fantasy. There is no going back to that time. And even if you could, that time wasn't all that great for a whole lot of people.
I thought it was very profound what you said about how make America great again for a lot of these people is just 2012. It's like the Obama presidency. And I mean, if it was going well, why did we elect Trump, folks? I mean, how many times have I played that clip here of when Obama was like, my name may not be on the ballot, but everything I've ever done is on the ballot? How'd that work out? His very last speech for Hillary Clinton, he put his own personal dynamism, everything on the line for his election in 2016, and America rejected it. Look, you can make the argument, it's a slim margin. It was slim, if it had been overwhelming in terms of referendum on him, Hillary would have won the election, but she didn't. And I just think that nobody can really grapple with so many of the underlying facts. I mean, we both just grappled with this recently. It was hilarious, where Daniel Marins, our friend at the Huffington Post, wrote that piece about, he's like, Trump has failed to live up to some populist promises. And I couldn't even believe this. He was getting attacked from people on the left, being like, no, it had nothing to do with any of this. It had nothing to do with economics. And I'm like, are you people out of your minds? How do 7 million people go from voting for a black man named Barack Hussein Obama to Donald Trump? Do you think it has something to do with racism? Or do you think it has something to do with, what either candidate was saying? Maybe about the GM bailout versus steel tariffs. Maybe that has more of a connective tissue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these things are all deeply intertwined. And so what they've always been engaged in since Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton was explaining that away and making excuses for it in a way that did not indict Hillary herself and did not indict the neoliberal project of multiple decades. And so since they cover that up very effectively with a lot of assist from the media, it means that there was never any reckoning with that era, and there were never any adjustments made. So now you're in this really weird zone of Joe Biden very likely to be the next president. He is the most, if you were going to take cookie cutter neoliberal establishment figure, it's him with this very conventional rhetoric that could come out of any Democratic campaign over the past 40 years. And you're going to try to stuff that back in this town and be like, see, it's all fine and Trump's gone and now we're good to go. And look, I don't think that that's going to go that well. I think it's going to be incredibly rocky. I think the forces that are sort of coming, because remember, this isn't just an America trend. Trump isn't just an aberration here. We've had a roiling of politics all around the globe. You can't just piece that back together, get rid of Trump, and think that it's all going to go smooth and fine. I think that's exactly what a lot of people think and hope, though. They really believe that if they just vote this guy out of office, then everything is going to be fine and okay. And it's never been less fine and okay. Take Trump out of it. Look at the economic trends. Look at the trends. Look at what we're living through with this pandemic. That stuff is not all just going to go away. And if Biden comes into office with this very conventional approach of the cupboard is bare, we can't really do that much, and I'm going to ask nicely for Wall Street to play by the rules, but I'm not actually going to change the rules, and very much wedded to the system as it exists, it's going to end again in terrible, disastrous result.
Yeah, do always bet on trends. Don't just bet on like discrete one-time outcomes. Elections are complicated. Every 4 years, a lot can go into it. Actually, what happens in the lead up to for the last 3 weeks of the election usually has more to do than the last 4 years before the election.
Yeah.
Look at the trends that lead to some of the underlying things that we're seeing within our country, and you'll generally see where things are going from there. Next on Rising, just a little over a year, and the 1619 Project continues to be a lightning rod for controversy, so journalist Zed Jelani is going to come back to discuss the new line of criticism when Rising continues.